Hello, so this is a little video to kind of get you on track on metering on manual mode. Um, a lot of students, if it's your first time working in manual modes, it's going to take a little bit of time to master these settings. It's not going to be probably automatic that you get this right off the bat, no pun intended. So if you're starting to use manual modes for the first time, your images might look worse for a little while. Right? You're going to have a hard time getting them to be quite perfect. You're going to kind of try to be focusing on the settings and camera controls. It's going to be a hard time to figure out composition and do all of those things at once. Don't worry, you'll get through this. It's going to be just fine. Now, I will also say that in an in-person class, it's much easier for me just to kind of go around and show you on your specific camera model where these controls are. So if you are feeling stuck still after this lecture, and even from this little video, you're not really getting where those controls are, you're welcome to either make an appointment to chat with me during office hours. I can send you a Zoom link. I can try to point out on your camera via Zoom where those controls are, or you could bring your camera to the photo lab and they can show you. The important thing is just don't give up. Right? I mean, it's really going to be a very simple thing once you find out where the settings are to adjust. Once you get this, most students can get this in a few minutes, just the basics of how to make those adjustments. Fine-tuning them and making them perfect is going to take a lot longer, but at least, kind of getting how to work with it and where they are, that'll be very quick. You just need to know where the settings are. So if you're still not getting it after this, don't give up. There are still other things you can do. All right, so for this course, in all but the first assignment, you're going to be using this, manual metering mode. Right? So everything's going to be shot in this M mode. Now this dial's usually in the very top of your camera body. All these rest of these settings are going to be some kind of an auto mode. The only one that's manual is this M1. All the rest of them are semi-automatic modes or fully automatic modes. So this little data panel you have right here will show you if you're working in the correct mode. If you were in manual mode, it will show you M right here. If you're in one of the auto settings, such as program or TV or AV, it'll show you and indicate that right here. Might look a little different depending on your camera model, but they all show you basically the same thing. Now, you basically have the mode that you're in, which will be manual for this course. This is your shutter speed. It'll usually be designated by a fraction, right? Some cameras just show you the whole number, so it'll be numbers like, 500, 1000, all the way down to 1 second, even longer to 30 seconds. This is your aperture. It usually has a little F next to it. That's your f-stop, right? That's the numbers assigned to those aperture settings. So your aperture right here is going to be adjusted, and I'll show you that in a second. ISO, in general in this course, you're going to try to work with your ISO at 400 or below. Above 400, you're going to have lots of noise. So try to avoid putting it above 400 when you can. If you're in a situation where it's, dark and you don't have a tripod and you know you're going to have camera shake, okay, you need to increase your ISO in those situations. But in general, if you have a tripod, use your tripod. Unless you're trying to, freeze motion in low light, there's really very little reason to increase ISO above 400. Okay, so for exposure, the aperture and shutter work together to create exposures. The shutter is that mechanism. It's basically right behind your lens. It opens and closes like a little curtain, right, to let light into your camera. And it opens for a certain amount of time. So the shutter controls the duration or the time of the exposure. The aperture is a little diaphragm inside of your lens that expands and contracts, and it controls the amount of light coming into your camera. So every exposure you take is some combination of aperture and shutter. So if there are numbers like 1, 2, 4, those are going to be a very long amounts of time for your shutter speed. Numbers like 1,500, those are going to be very fast. Not a lot of light's coming into your camera through time. For your f-stops, if your aperture is fully dilated, you have an f-stop like 1.7, 2.8, 4. If you're using a zoom lens, your apertures may not get much wider than 5.6. That's pretty normal. There are just some things you're going to have to do to compensate for that, but it's absolutely fine. All right. So again, you have this whole range of f-stops you can choose for any given image, right? Not only does it control how much light comes into your your photograph, which is going to control your exposure, aesthetically, what it controls is depth of field, right? So depth of field is the amount of a scene from near to far that appears sharp, appears in focus. For a shallow depth of field, that means only the little bit of space you have right around your focus subject is going to be in focus. Everything else is going to appear blurry. For a broad depth of field, everything you have from near to far is going to appear crisply focused. So small apertures such as f/22 create a broad depth of field. Wide apertures such as f2 create a shallow depth of field. And one thing to note, this is one of the more confusing things in photography, and if you're experiencing this, you're not alone. This is something that happens to a lot of people. You do not see what depth of field actually looks like when using small apertures such as f/22 when looking through your viewfinder. Right? So here's what your camera does. Your camera is going to basically leave your aperture on whatever the widest setting is for that lens when you're shooting. And it does this because it thinks you need as much light as possible to compose your shots and to see. If you were actually using f/22, it's a tiny hole, not letting in much light, your scene would look really dark looking through your viewfinder, even if your exposure was adjusted. So your camera doesn't actually close down to whatever small aperture you selected until you press your shutter button. When you take the picture and press your shutter button, it goes from this to this. Right? If you had selected f/22 as your aperture, it would go all the way from your widest setting at f2, and only when you take your take your photograph, would it close down to the aperture you've pre-selected. So otherwise, what you're seeing looking through your scene is this, which creates this confusing thing, right? We're used to thinking of DSLR and mirrorless cameras as being really accurate in terms of composition, in terms of showing us what we're going to get. But it isn't accurate at showing us that information in terms of depth of field, unless you're using a depth of field preview button. Now, the depth of field preview button, I did give you some, tutorials on how to use that. If you have that setting in the depth of field lecture, you can do that. If not, it's not really a big deal, though. There's other ways of seeing it. But just remember, right, if you're looking through doing the depth of field project and you're looking through your viewfinder and you just don't see that the background looks sharp and crisp to you, it won't until the photograph is taken, even if you have selected the right small aperture such as f/22. So what students try to do if they kind of forget that is they change their focus point instead of changing their depth of field. So just focusing on near to far, that's not going to change your depth of field, right, in the way that we're looking for in the assignment. So what you have to do is actually change your aperture to affect depth of field. You can't just change your focus point to have that happen. So that's sort of the most common mistake people make when kind of learning these techniques. Now remember, the cameras don't actually show you the broad depth of field if your camera is set to a small aperture. They only see your widest aperture setting looking through the viewfinder. So again, unless you use that button, you're not going to see it. But just take a picture, like set it to f/22 meter to make sure you have the right information. And when you're looking through, you're reviewing your photographs, you can see if the depth of field changed between the shots. So your aperture, here's how you adjust it, right? Your camera, again, has to be on this M mode right here. And on the back of your camera, you probably have a little button that looks like this. Right, this is your aperture adjustment button. When you're in one of the auto modes, this actually does exposure compensation and something else. So don't do that on the auto modes. But on manual modes, this is what you use to control your aperture. So this little AV or plus and minus button, it's usually found on the back of the camera or the top of the camera for a lot of Nikons, and it's right by the shutter release button, right? So it'll be very close to that. So what you do is you press and hold the button in, and at the same time you move this little dial right here, right? When you move that little dial right here, you should be able to change your aperture to whatever you want. So what I want you to do is first try setting it to 5.6. Then you're going to do metering, figure out your right exposure. I'll show you that in a minute. And then I want you to go back after you've done that and figured out the photograph and taken it looks good, and you're going to basically set that to f/22 and just remeter, right? Now you've gone from a very wide aperture to a tiny aperture, not letting in much light. If you go from 5.6 to 22, you need to use a longer shutter speed to compensate for that exposure difference. So your image will be really dark and underexposed if you don't. So all you basically do is then you just re-meter, let more light into your camera by having a longer shutter speed, and that will give you a correct exposure for that smaller aperture. Okay, so again, your shutter is that little set of curtains that opens and closes to allow the duration of the exposure. Aesthetically, what the shutter controls is the appearance of motion blur. If nothing's moving in your shot, you're not going to see anything change, right? But if there's something moving in your shot, depending on the shutter speed you select, you can create frozen motion or blurred motion. So, again, this is what I don't want you to photograph for the assignment number 2, but just to kind of give you an example, for this fast-moving fan, you can freeze motion at this fan at around 1,000th of a second for a very fast-moving subject. Anything slower than that for your shutter speed, even though these are pretty fast shutter speeds, they're going to have more, increasing amounts of motion blur that are visible in your shot. So here's how you control your shutter speed. You just don't press the AV button, right? If you have 2 dials, one will control your aperture and one will control your shutter. But if you only have that one little dial right on top, you don't have this big dial in the back. So on some camera models, this controls your aperture. On some, it controls your shutter. On some, you can change it. But if you don't have this dial in the back of your camera body, the back lower side, then it's just this dial you have on top. For most starter cameras, DSLR cameras, that's where it's going to be. This controls your shutter. So your shutter, again, it's all those fractions. So this is 500, but that really means 1/500th of a second, which is pretty fast. That's going to be a fast enough shutter speed to freeze a lot of motion that you do. So now this exposure was at 500 at an aperture of 5.6. All right, so for your exposure, just remember that your aperture and shutter work together to create exposures. These two are equivalent exposures, meaning the same exact amount of light came into the camera in both cases, right? But what's going to change is the appearance of motion blur if something's moving in your shot and your depth of field. If you're shooting at f/16, you're going to have a more broad depth of field. More is going to be in focus from near to far. If you're using f/8, it's just a little bit wider, but it's still wider. Depth of field is going to start narrowing a little bit and shrinking around your focus subject. So at 1/25th, if something's moving, that's going to be closer to getting frozen motion depending on what the subject is. If something is moving very slowly, it might be freezing motion entirely. 1/30th, depending on what's moving in your shot, might show some motion blur. If it's a really fast-moving subject, that'll be enough to to blur a little bit of motion. Normally, though, if you want to really show blurred motion, you're talking more about exposures that are 1/15th of a second or slower. 1 second would be a good safe one to use for that. So here are some equivalent exposures, right? 3.5, which is a wide aperture, giving you a shallow depth of field, and 1/640th, a pretty fast shutter speed. Here's 5.6, here's f10, and here's f22. So in all cases, you focused on the leaves in the foreground. Remember, you're only going to be seeing this. If this is your widest aperture, you'll see this looking through your lens. Even if you set your camera to f22, you're still going to look at and see that looking through your viewfinder. But just know that if your camera is set to f22, it'll expand to have this background be in focus as well.